At this point, we've completed the first chapter, which deals with playing with only chord tones, and we're ready to move on to a new concept, which is going to be improvising with chord tones and approach tones, in this case from a half step below. So we need a definition of an approach tone. An approach tone, in this case, is going to be a note that is traveling towards a chord tone, and in the case of this specific chapter, it's going to be traveling to that chord tone from a half step below. So for example, if we had a B flat 7 chord, an approach tone might be the note A going to the B flat. So that would be a half step approach tone going up towards the root. Now that A, which is the approach tone, you'll notice is not a chord tone. If it were a chord tone, that would be an A flat. But this is different. This is an approach tone. There are a ton of reasons to use approach tones, but one of them is it gets us away from using just those 4 basic chord tones in a way that's still going to lead us towards the chord tones, focusing on those notes and giving us consonant sounding lines. It also tends to introduce some chromaticism into the lines, which is an important part of jazz and the bebop vocabulary especially. So to take another example, if we had an E flat 7 chord, for example, we might play G flat going into G. That would be a half step approach tone going towards the 3rd of that chord. And that G flat is not one of the chord tones, and it's not even one of the scale tones that we would normally associate with an E flat 7 chord. In other words, the E flat Mixolydian scale. So we get some chromaticism in there. And most importantly, this gives us a tool to use so that we're not just using those basic chord tones. This is going to allow us way more flexibility in terms of the color that we can demonstrate harmonically in our lines. So I'm going to play this next example. So this is the blues using chord tones and approach tones from a half step below those chord tones. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, so there's the demonstration. You can hear that there's a lot more color going on than the first example where I was only using those chord tones. So by using approach tones, we can introduce another really important concept, which is voice leading. And voice leading, kind of generically, means that we want to be conscientious of how our melodic line is traveling. So do we have really smooth shapes like that, or do we have really dramatic angles? And approach tones tend to lead you towards really good voice leading because, of course, whenever we have an approach tone, we're going from a note a half step below a chord tone to a chord tone. That's going to be really smooth voice leading as opposed to jumping maybe from a 5th or 6th above or below the note. So that's a really important concept in how you choose to create your melodies and your solos, and approach tones do a lot of that work for you. The most important rule that I can think about with approach tones is that approach tones are a one-way street, meaning they only go approach tone and then a chord tone following it. They never go chord tone and then the approach tone, because you ruin the sense of resolution. So for example, if we were on a B flat 7 chord, if I use my previous example of an A going into a B flat, that's a really nice consonant resolution. But if I go B flat and then I end on the note A, our ear hears that A as our resolution, and that is not a consonant note with that B flat 7 chord at all. So one-way street. You can go approach tone to chord tone, but not the other direction unless you follow it again with another chord tone. So for example, we could have approach tone to chord tone, back to approach tone, but only if it follows with another chord tone after that. So you must follow your approach tones with chord tones, assuming that you want to be consonant. All right, so what to practice with this concept? The first thing that you should probably do is practice these half-step approach tones without improvising at all. So for example, I could practice playing half-step approach tones into each root on the blues. I'll play a little sample of that. So it might sound like this. 1, 2, 3. Etc. So I'm just getting my brain used to thinking about how those approach tones work and getting them under my fingers, just as we did with the arpeggios for chord tones. You could try this not only with the roots, but of course with the thirds, fifths, and sevenths as well, making sure that you're comfortable with all of them. The next thing to do is to play a chord tone only solo, just like we did in the previous chapter, but mix in a couple of approach tones. So not the whole time, but maybe just throw in a couple and see if it really is working for you, or if you're getting caught up somehow on something that you need to practice first. Finally, you can practice your solo with chord tones and approach tones, as many as you want to throw in. Keep in mind that every chord tone does not need to be preceded by an approach tone. It's just an option. It can be, so it doesn't need to be 100% of the time. And this is really important when you're practicing any of the concepts that I'm describing in these videos. Try to stay really accurate. So hopefully you only moved on to this video once you could play the chord tone only soloing very accurately. Now, add in these approach tones sort of incrementally, bit by bit, so that you're still feeling like you're as close to 90 to 100% accurate as you can be. If you find yourself missing notes, or for instance, going from a chord tone to an approach tone, going against that one-way street that I described, might be time to back up, practice the approach tones on their own again, and then introduce them into your improvisation a little more slowly. Another tip that I have for any of these concepts that we're working on is, if you're having trouble introducing them into your solo, leave more space in the solo. Because anytime you have space, that allows you some time to sort of mentally reset, re-engage with the time, and think about what you're going to do next. In this case, maybe calculating that approach tone.